Here we go. Good morning, dear friends. It is Monday, March 21st. What are we? We're Adar 17. Mark, is that correct? Yud Zayin? Yud Ches? You see, I tried to steal a day, but I guess it doesn't work. Anyways, we're here to study the Talmud. Hope everyone had a nice Shabbos, Sunday. And we're talking about salt. Actually, the Mishnah talks about salt water, brine. And we discussed the Mishnah's sentiment that prohibits creating hilmi, brine, or everyone can agree it's water with a lot of salt. Why is it prohibited? So we mostly focused on Rashi, which is the prevailing pshat, that it is a tolda or related to tanning, just as the tanning process is the introduction of chemicals to hide, to change its composition, and to turn it into something durable. And part of that process is the application of salt on the hides, as we learned in the Mishnah a while ago. Well, similarly, the application of salt to foods causes its consistency to change, possibly to become more durable. But regardless, it either softens it or hardens it, which is akin to tanning. I should have added that the Rambam, actually, maybe we saw it in passing in the Meiri. There are those who say that actually the prohibition of salt water making brine is not so much, and this will ring true to, I think, some of you. Maybe we even brought it up, but I don't recall. Not that it is tanning, but it is like cooking, because the effect that the salt has on, or the salt water has on the food, is something like bishul. It is not bishul, and it probably would not even be considered, with this interpretation, a biblical prohibition, even a tolda. But the Rambam's viewpoint, I think the Meiri quoted it, is that it is a byproduct of bishul. But the bulk of our discussion was and is and will remain from the perspective that it is a part of the malacha of ibud or ma'abed orot, tanning, and that was the basis for prohibition. As you recall, our Mishnah brought two opinions about the Mishnah brought two opinions about brine. Is it all salt water prohibited? Meaning, is it prohibited to create salt water on Shabbos always? Or is it really only very intensely heavy, thick brine? The Gemara is going to discuss in a moment a little more about that. Just to note that, the Gemara on Friday wondered, the rabbi who says, isn't all salt water salty, or isn't all salt water briny? And we weren't sure. The Gemara asked, does this mean that he wants to make all salt water permissible or prohibited? And it appears that the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, if I recall, is to prohibit it. Dr. Hammer asked the question, and we'll see it just after getting into the Gemara, which is a very good question, and it's a applicable question, was the question of salt water on Pesach. As we know, today most Jews dip their karpas in salt water. But let's ask a question. Eli, in your family tradition, when you do karpas, can you describe what karpas looks like? The thing that happens after you make kiddush.
Yeah, you dip it with the salt.
Yeah. So what do you dip? And what do you dip it into?
Into water with salt.
Okay, salt water. Anybody here use something other than salt water for karpas? Okay,
No,
that certainly is the prevailing minhag. The interesting thing is, and maybe we'll pull it up and we'll see. I just wanted to put it out there because the doctor asked a good question, and we'll get to the answer bli neder in the course of today's discussion. Let's share the screen. Let's
Rabbi,
to the Gemara. Yes, Alan, go ahead.
talking about salt, the best salt in the world is the salt from the Dead Sea. I did a whole
why do you say that?
We did a whole study on this a long time ago, and the Dead Sea has more ingredients in it, like sodium, magnesium, calcium, sulfur, bromide, iodine, potassium. It's got all the ingredients of salt that the ocean doesn't even have that.
Are you saying that when they sell those creams in the store, it is not just an enterprising young man or woman from Israel hoping to sell Dead Sea mishchaot? You're saying those are actually healthy and good for you?
They're supposed to be.
Wonderful. I'm glad you brought that up because today the Gemara is going to talk about the Dead Sea too. So our Chabura has been very much on target. I think Dr. Hammer brought it up on Friday as well. So I should give him credit too. And Alan, we missed you these few days. Welcome back. Let's get started. So the Gemara provides us a mnemonic, a siman. To remember, the next 4 halachot or 3 halachot are azin, about strong salt, sinon, radishes, the etrog, and we're going to reference the etrog, and I believe they're all from the same author, which is why we're being given this clue to what's about to come our way. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Tani, Rabbi Yehuda bar Chaviva taught, Ein oisin mei melach azin. One is not permitted to make strong salt water. Obviously, this is related to our Gemara, which is talking about the prohibition of making salt water or strong salt water. Mai mei melach azin. So how do we determine if it is just nominally salty or super salty? It's a strong salt water. So Rabba and Rav Yosef bar Abba, the Amri Tarvayu, so Rabba and Rav Yosef both taught the following criteria. I believe we mean independently, but they came to the same conclusion. Kol shehabetza salfa bahen, water that is so salty that if you place an egg inside of it, the egg floats. Now, if you place an egg in water, will it float? No. But if the water has enough salt, I guess it has a degree of density which will cause the egg to float, if that's how it works. And that's what we're saying. If you place enough salt, that the egg is going to float. I want to read how Rashi explains it. Koyach hamelach me'akeves milish koya. The salt has the ability to prevent sinking. That's how Rashi explains it.
Just like we see, better than the ocean, and an ocean better than the pool.
So, Mark, let me ask you: you put an egg in the pool, will it sink?
Yeah, I'm saying you put an egg in a bowl of water, it goes to the bottom.
It'll sink. And what if you put an egg in the ocean?
Not sure. I haven't tried it.
Mark, you've never thought to bring an egg with you into the ocean?
I guess it's different. Is it hard boiled going to be different than a raw
That's an
egg?
interesting question. So let's see. Vikama, how much salt is so salty that an egg will float? Amar Abaya. This is a lot of salt. Trey tilse milcha, the tilsa maya. We're talking about 2 measures of salt to a third water. So we're not talking about very salty water. We're talking about more salt than water. That's a high proportion of.
That's probably not going to even flow, really, is it? It's going to be
I'm sorry.
more like a paste. That's probably going to be more like a paste when it was that much salt.
I don't know. Alvin, any thoughts? You're muted. You're muted.
You have to be careful when you talk about eggs, because if they float while they're in the shell, you have to throw them out.
Really? Why?
Because there's a buildup of gas from old eggs that keeps them afloat. Whereas a regular egg, if it's fresh, it'll sink right to the bottom in the shell.
In fresh water, though, and salt water might be different.
Bottom line,
Could be.
Abaya is giving us a very high proportion of salt to water. And I have a feeling most of the salt waters that we would use or experience is likely not to contain this amount of salt water. Would you agree?
I mean, usually with salt, once you put it in, it dissolves into it, but there comes a saturation point after which it does not dissolve anymore. And then you can start seeing the particles, they just don't dissolve. It's a supersaturated solution.
So are you saying that much salt wouldn't actually disintegrate?
I don't know how much salt, but there's a limit to how much salt will dissolve into water.
Rabbi,
Yes, Rebero.
first of all, we have some background noise.
Still? Because I hit mute all.
Secondly, I'm
Hold
trying
on,
to
Rebero,
think,
one second.
I'm trying to think in the real world, what's going on here? You have you're preparing, you can prepare a little salt water, don't put in too much. What are we trying to get at?
You're not going to know until we finish the Gemara. But we're not getting at anything. Right now we're describing, are you allowed to make salt water? What we're getting at will become a little clearer at the end of the Gemara. But the first thing that we've established is that you're not allowed to create a brine, a salt water mixture.
But,
Our
but
Mishnah,
Rabbi, but I know, but trying to think, first of all, depends on the size of the egg. Different eggs, brown eggs, white. I can imagine we could have an experiment here with 10 beakers to keep adding salt at what point? At what point is the egg floating? I mean, I don't understand where we're going.
the Gemara here seems very happy to generalize, and it seems to work. We're talking. So I'll tell you what I learned here. If you would have asked me, what would you consider very salty water? I don't know, a cup of water and 3 tablespoons of salt. That's a lot of salt.
Well, the maximum.
Discovered that
So
possibly
if you
according to this.
Google it, it gives you at 1 liter of water can dissolve about 357 grams of salt.
What is that?
1 liter of water can dissolve about 357 grams of salt. That's the
about one-
saturation level of
1/3.
salt.
The 1/3 of the salt.
Yeah, a concentration of about 26.3.
Yeah, I looked it up and it was 93 grams in a cup of water. Same general idea.
So again, Rabbi, not to go there too deep. When we prepare salt water at the Seder, we don't
Hold on,
count
hold on.
anything.
I told you we're going to get there. We're going to get there. Hold on.
But we have no criteria. We just make a little bit of salt. No?
Beryl, hold on. We don't have enough information to really discuss this with. We're going to see soon. We're going to have all the building blocks to ask the question. When are you leaving today? 10:30?
10:30. I have to
So
go make
let's
salt.
rush.
I have to make salt water.
All right, so let's read a little bit of the Gemara and then we'll take a look in the Shulchan Aruch so that we get to it before you leave.
Okay, sorry.
No worries. Shkayach for the question. Hold on. I'm going to buy a trotil milcha v'tilsa maya. The proportion is 2/3 salt of the water. That's a lot of salt. L'maya avdila. Who and why and what would you ever need this kind of salt? Amar Rav Abayu limor yasa, to create a brine for fish. Today we like a lox, or I don't know. Well, in those days they would have all this kind of very salty preserved fish. Furthermore, Tani Rabbi Yehuda bar Chaviva in Molchin Sunai no beitza b'Shabbos. The same Rabbi Yehuda ben Chaviva taught another halacha, that you're not allowed to salt a radish or an egg on Shabbos. Rashi says, Gimel v'dalid chatichas yachad. You're not allowed to salt a bunch of radish pieces or egg. Shamelech ma'abdon v'nasen koshin. The salt causes some chemical change. The hevetikon, and it is beneficial. They are improved, both the radish and the egg. Rav Chizkiya disagrees and says, Mishmei Abaye says, Tanoin, Aser, a radish you may not salt. Ubeitza, muteres, but you are allowed to salt an egg. Mind you, here we're not talking about salt water. Here we're talking about the direct application of salt. Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman comments and says, Mireish, have a melachana pulga. Initially, I would salt radishes on Shabbos. Why? I said, we are actually not improving the pulga v'tzanoin. We are kind of ruining it. Then you'll ask the question, why was he putting it on if he felt he was ruining it? Well, let's see. Damar Shmuel, pulga chorfei mali.
Are you allowed to ruin something on Shabbos?
Hold on. 1 second. Damar Shmuel, pugla chorfei mali. A good radish is sharp. The sharper it is, the better it is. So by you putting on salt and diffusing the natural sharpness of the radish, you're essentially de-radishing, you're diminishing the kunst, you're diminishing the oomph of the radish. But then Kivan de Shemana Laha, but then Rav Nachman says, I heard a teaching. Because Ula came from Israel to Bavel. Ula would travel back and forth, and he shared the following: V'amar b'ma'arava, in Israel, in the shawarma shops, mochi kishri. They would really salt the radishes extensively, and therefore mimlach malachna. I therefore ceased salting my radishes because now I understand that within the Jewish culture there is a notion that salting your radishes could actually improve them. But still, tabule vade metabalena. He says, I yet continued to dip my radishes in salt. I just wouldn't process them with vast amounts of salt. What's the difference between calling it salting versus dipping? So Rashi explains, or yet Rashi says, shtayim yachad. He's talking about more than one. So if you're salting one to eat, you're just salting your food. But if you're salting a larger number, the way Rashi learns that, and this will become relevant in the halacha, which is why I'm emphasizing it, even though Rashi doesn't seem to be reading the same text we're reading. Dr. Hammer?
You keep on saying it improves them, but you're talking about improves the taste. And taste, we all go to, I mean, it seems absurd to tell people. So they did it in Israel. They don't do it in Israel. You like your egg with a little salt. You like it with pepper, whatever. Where does a Gemara come to tell you that it's wrong to eat in a way that you are going to get the most hana from?
The Gemara is not telling you that it is wrong to eat the way you like it. The Gemara is telling you that if this is a common and legitimate way of processing this food, well, then it shouldn't be done on Shabbos. If you have a one-off quirk that you like your radishes different than the rest of the world, okay, that's not cooking. It has to do with it has to do with the question of, are you creating a process that is akin to tanning? So leather, hide, people salt. Certain foods people salt. Other foods people don't salt. And so the Gemara was going through this process of discovering, or Rav Nachman is revealing to us his own internal process. When we'll look at the Shulchan Aruch, I think it'll become a little more, but we'll see how certain principles are extracted from this discussion. So I want to go into the Shulchan Aruch to see how they paskin halacha lemaisa, how they paskin this question. So there's a section, So in the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, there's a section called different kinds of ways of getting your food to the table, and the malachas that are associated with it. And so the second halacha here is ein oisin memelach harbe biyachad. You can't make a large quantity of salt water. La seis letoich hakvashim, which is used to put into your pickled items. Mishum dedami leibud. Again, this is the words of Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch, quoting our Gemara. It's akin to me'abed, it's akin to tanning. As I noted to you previously, the Rambam has a different take on this. So you can't do a lot, because a lot, quantities for purposes of down the road, for preserving, that's going to be me'abed. You're allowed to make a small proportion, to use as seasoning. However, if you made it very, very, very salty, so our Mishnah teaches a distinction between very salty and not salty, and also we talk about the purpose of pickling. So very salty you're never allowed to do, but somewhat salty, the Mishnah, based on the Gemara that we learned, you could make a small amount, which is just for the moment, but it is not for long-term pickling and not for long-term work. That's the bottom line of this text. Now we're going to see the next segment. You're not allowed to salt pieces of radish, multiple together. Again, here we're not talking about salt water anymore, because by putting salt on a number of vegetables, the appearance is that you are engaging in the act of pickling. And you're certainly not allowed to actually pickle, because that's akin to, and here he says cooking. Elametabel kolechad levada, but you could dip each one individually. Ve'oichlan eat it, and beitzim muter lemalchan. And then he takes like the second opinion in the Gemara, who says that you're allowed to dip eggs, you're not allowed to dip radish.
Rabbi.
Hold on. I want to do this fast because I want to show you the discussion about salt water before 10:30. Yesh mishakasav. There's another opinion that says shemut little kama chatichos. You're allowed to dip many pieces one at a time. Even if afterwards they all sit together. So if you're going to do multiple pieces, but it is all for a single meal, that would be acceptable. And then he says, you're not allowed to salt food for preservation down the road. You could salt your food for Shabbos, etc. Anyways, this is the discussion about salting stuff on Shabbos. We said you're allowed to create salt water that's not too salty, so long as it is for this meal. You're not allowed to create very salty water, even for the moment. And you're not allowed to create large quantities of salt water down the road. So help me really fast. And Roberto, I know you have to go. What would this mean for Pesach? On Pesach, everyone here uses karpas. And this year, hold on, I didn't look at the calendar. I should. I believe the first night of the Seder is Friday night. Is that correct?
I think so.
And so this is a question that's Nageya for this year. You should prepare for your Seder before Pesach starts. But let's say you're going through the kitchen and you're getting everything, and all of a sudden your salt water that you bought from a resourceful young yeshiva student outside the kosher store, special salt water for karpas, it spills all over, and now it's Shabbos and it's Pesach, and you need karpas. And although the kid who you scolded for spilling it is crying, it's not enough salt water. No, there's not enough tears for karpas. So what do? So this is a good question. So I didn't find this in the Shulchan Aruch, but I find this in the Shulchan Aruch Harav. And it may be in the Shulchan Aruch, and I just didn't look well enough. So here we go. This is the words of the Baal Tanya, Taf Ayin Gimel, which is the laws of Pesach. Before you dip your vegetable in vinegar or salt water, and the like, you have to wash your hands without a bracha, because whenever you dip something in water, you need to make nitilas yadayim without a bracha. Then he says, Ayin b'simin shem chaval. Take a look at the laws of Shabbos. Shimcho Pesach b'Shabbos. If Pesach is on Shabbos, like our year, Yachol la'asot hamei melach b'Shabbat. One is permitted to make salt water. Why? Because you're allowed to make salt water on Shabbos. Ubilvad shelo yaseh elo ma'at mize'er. But make sure you're only making a little amount of salt water. Only what is needed for this very act of dipping karpas. Why? You're allowed to make salt water. You can't make a lot of salt water for future events. People are not used to making so little salt water just to give you coverage for the Seder. Ideally, a person should endeavor to make their salt water before Shabbos. But if a person forgot, what do? Yaseh b'Shabbos ma'at mize'er. You can make a small quantity of salt water for the purposes of your soda. So there you have it. The question that a few of our scholars asked, explicitly and specifically dealt with here in the Shulchan Aruch. Yes.
One more question. Are we talking here strictly for food? What about making salt water for other reasons?
So we're going to get to that in the course of our Gemara, hopefully tomorrow.
Okay.
So it's a good question. I just don't want to jump the gun. The Gemara talks about using salt water, and it even talks about, like Alan said, using Mei Sedom water. I'm sorry, the Dead Sea water. So that Hashem self will get there in due time.
Is there any, Rabbi?
Yes.
Is there any justification for having individual, cups of salt water for everyone at a Seder versus more of a communal salt water for dipping in, which is
You're asking a question about Pesach or a question about this year's Shabbos? If you're making salt water, what's a little?
Pesach. I'm talking in general Pesach.
No, I'm saying you're asking every Pesach or for this Pesach?
I'm asking both, but start with every Pesach.
So I'll tell you the truth. I don't know. What I recall growing up, which is, every family has their own way of doing things. I think we had a few bowls of salt water, but I don't remember every person getting salt water. But I could tell you a svara why. It's possible that it's nothing to do with halacha, but rather if every kid got a bowl of salt water, you can imagine what the table is going to look like. I think maybe
Pikuach nefesh.
There's a lot of interesting things. So for example, on the Seder plate, you have karpas. Is that the karpas that you use for that's the karpas that you use, right?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So there's different because if you eat the karpas, then the simon is gone from your Seder plate. So
Right.
some people do, some people don't. There's another interesting thing, which I don't know the reason behind it, but karpas, many people, I think American Jewry and elsewhere, you imagine karpas to be parsley or how do you call it? Parsley or
Celery.
That's a very common
Right.
item for karpas. I think Russian Jewry tend to use onion or potato.
Potatoes, I think they use.
Potatoes. And so many folks here, and I bet when I say Russia, I mean Russia. I mean like the kingdom, that region, Lithuania, Russia. I think people use potato and onion. I have a theory. That was probably what was most easily available in that time. You didn't have green stuff growing around necessarily in those regions, but potatoes and onions were common. So and I think that I think we might say that today that is lemaisa more prevalent. But if you look at old Haggadahs, and they're all okay. I'm not trying to, but if you look at older Haggadahs, you'll usually see a picture of a celery or a parsley. Chabad, for some reason, prefers, and I don't know exactly the extent of it, prefers onion over potato. So at our Seder growing up, and in my in-laws, for example, on the Seder plate is a little onion, a little whole onion. They get these baby, pearl onions. But they also have potato for those that don't want to eat onions. But everyone has their own traditions, and it's always interesting to figure out where it came from. Was it because of what was available, or were the kids noshing on? You have to only have a small a shear of karpas, because otherwise you're going to make a bracha achroina and it's going to interfere with a mur. So maybe they figured if we'll put onion, people aren't going to be chomping on onions, so it would help avoid the issue of having the shear that's chayv bracha achroina. So I don't know the origin of it. But anyway,
I apologize for leaving, although you might be happier.
we're not happy you're leaving, but I'm happy that we at least got to see the question that you asked resolved before you left. So yeah, sure.
Tomorrow.
So I guess the other question, which I think we can answer, is what about, many people, and we've discussed this, you dip your karpas, and then people also dip the egg in salt water. And I think this is particularly, I've been led to believe this is particularly a Lithuanian minhag. But maybe others did it as well. But so I suppose you'd be allowed to make enough salt water for that as well, because it's part of the same seudah. What you would not be able to do on Shabbos, especially in this regards, is prepare enough salt water for the second Seder. So you'd have to end up making more salt water the next night. Again, or it was on the floor? Okay, sure. Anyway, so this is the story of salt water, particularly on Pesach. Actually, give me one more. I actually brought here to the table, if I could find it, when I left it. All right, let's look really fast in the Shulchan Aruch. Taf Ayin Gimel. Let's just look real fast. If they have, no. Bear with me. 473. So here, this is the Shulchan Aruch as composed by Rav Karo with the glosses of the Ramah. Here is the discussion of karpas. Interesting thing, just as a side note, again, this is not the subject of our primary exploration today, but here he says you wash your hands to dip. less than a kazayis, and he says dip it in chaymetz, dip it in vinegar. He doesn't even mention salt water here, which probably explains why he doesn't talk about making salt water. That's why really fast. I'm just curious. Here, look. Here the Mishnah Brura adds. Just again, once we read it, it's not really on. You dip it in vinegar or wine or salt water. The point is, you don't dip it in charaisis. So that, I suppose, is the reason why we don't really see a discussion about salt water, because he doesn't actually reference in the primary text the use of salt water. Now let's go back to our Gemara for one more moment, because what I want to see now is the Rambam. Let's see if we can compare how he describes the prohibition. Ma'arev here, Rambam. Ma'arev adam mayim umelach. A person is permitted to mix water and salt, vishemen, and then oil. The toil is pitoi to dip bread. You could use this as a seasoning, as a dressing. But on Shabbos you should only make a small quantity. Aval harba also, you're not allowed to make a lot. Here it looks like you're doing a melacha that's associated with cooking. And similarly, you can't make very salty water. So the Rambam, the bottom line, the Rambam seems to be saying pretty much what we've said all along: a distinction between a small amount and a large amount, and a lesser amount of salt versus a larger amount of salt. But again, he, based on the reading that's brought to our attention here, it's clear that he sees the malacha of saltwater creation differently than Rashi does, and he sees it differently than the other halachis who clearly say that it's connected to ma'abed. Doctor?
Are you making salt water if you pour salt into chicken soup broth, chicken soup broth?
I don't believe so, but what I know for sure is that if you put 2/3 salt, no one's going to eat your chicken soup.
Does it have to be put together, water and salt together? You can.
I'm sorry, again?
Does it have to be together, water and salt together? Or you can just dip the water and then dip in the salt?
You're talking about karpas?
Yeah.
I believe it is meant to be salt water to the extent that no one proposes what you're proposing, which is dip it first in salt and then water, first in water, then salt.
Yeah.
The Ar Sameach points out that the prohibition of salt water is a rabbinic prohibition connected to cooking, Rashi, which is distinctly not how Rashi learns the Gemara, which is Mishum Abed, Mishum Derava Amar Ein Ibud Ba'ichlin, Lahachi Pirish Rabbeinu. And the reason why the Rambam argues with Rashi is for an important reason. The Gemara Rava says that you cannot tan. There's no such thing as ibud with edibles. Ibud, ma'abed, tanning is something that happens to something that becomes a long-term accessory, not food. Therefore, the Rambam rejects Rashi's interpretation. And similarly, there are other areas in the discussion of the Gemara where the Rambam has a different understanding than Rashi, because food should, according to as the Rambam sees it, as the Gemara presents, can't be subject to some of the malachas that are not applicable to food. All right, let's go back into the Gemara now. We're going to meet Sodom. Interesting stuff. All right, Tani, Rabbi Yehuda ben Chaviva. The Gemara now is going to talk over here about what we said. Esrog, Tsunayin, Ubeitz. 3 types of foods that Rabbi Yehuda ben Chaviva says: the esrog, the radish, and the egg. Ilmale klipasan hachitzaina. If not for the fact that they had a outer peel, shell, covering, They would never be able to be digested. Interestingly enough, Rashi is going to correct me. I said an egg shell. But Rashi says the beitza hi hachelboin. We're talking about the white part of the egg. So, if not for the egg white, the egg yolk would be inedible. Rashi shemiskashin umiskashin v'ne'etzorin. It would become super hard, and it would essentially plug one's digestive tract. Now, to be honest, I don't know much about people eating esrogs straight. If you've ever tried it, you probably didn't try it again. Maybe as a jam, as a preserve, but you certainly don't want to chomp on an esrog as is. But what are we saying over here? All right, we'll take it as it we'll take it as it comes. But the long story short is each of these items need to have their outer shell, or they would be inedible. I am Pirish Rashi Zal here. This is the Ben Yehoyada. Hadavar Yipala being in Habetza. What are we talking about? The egg. The Yadua Shachel Bain who kaved v'kasha. V'achel min urach v'kal. Generally speaking, the chelboin, generally speaking, the white part I'm not on this ear. The chelboin here he's saying is heavier and harder than the yolk, but I'm not sure if that in my experience.
I thought the chelbon was the yolk.
Chelboin is the yolk or chelmon?
Oh,
Dr. Stamler?
actually, chelbon, yeah.
Chelbon is the white part. Chelmon is the yellow part, right?
Right.
Okay. Chelmon arach v'kal. And the yolk is soft. And physicians give a sick person the chelmon without the chelbon. Interesting. He says, on the contrary, the egg yolk enhances the egg white. Egg white on its own would be very soft and fleeting and disappear because of the balance of the yolk. And okay, so whatever. That's basically, he says with the radish and the esrog, it needs to have its peel. By the egg, it's not so much that it needs the protection of the cover, but the blending makes it a well-rounded meal. That's what he says. Anyways, interesting Gemara. I'm sure those that like to probe these kinds of things have a lot to say about figuring out exactly what the Gemara is talking about the egg. But we'll leave it at that because we have another interesting discussion that we need to get through, which is the question of Sidon, which we mean, of course, the Yam HaMelach. Also, Rav Dimi came to Israel. I'm sorry. Also, Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi arrived in Bavel, because again, the Gemara is the Bavli, and when he came to us, he said, "The Olam Leitava Gavra B'Yama this time." And where's Beryl? He just mentioned this. A person never drowned in the Dead Sea. Now, I don't think it means never drowned. It means a person never sunk. A person doesn't sink in the Dead Sea. Rashi. The salt the water is salty, very salty. And it is so salty that it does not allow things to sink in the sea. Rav Yosef retorted a very interesting comment. Sedaim was flipped over, and that's where we have Yam HaMelach, v'hafichon milha, and your word is confused. Why? Gavrahu deloy tova keshuda tova. When you say a person never sunk, a person never drowned, it sounds like you're saying that wood or other items do sink. And we know this is certainly not the case, because we know it is harder for a piece of wood to go underwater than it is for a person. Abaye says, no, you didn't understand. He was saying not only wood never sinks. That's why boats in ancient times were constructed of wood, or a raft is constructed of wood. Wood never sinks. Even a human, who they can sink, they can drown in the sea. They don't go under with the Dead Sea. So this is an interesting discussion about the Dead Sea. Again, most of us, all of us have been to the Dead Sea, and so the Gemara sounds very obvious. Well, first of all, if you lived in Babel, you're probably curious to know about the different important spaces in Israel, and the Dead Sea certainly would rank not to this day rank quite high. But the Gemara asks a question that you're probably wondering: Lamai nafkamina. Is there halachic relevance to the fact that the Dead Sea, that we're talking about the Dead Sea? Here is the relevance, as Ravin taught about the Dead Sea, or as Ravin would do. Havashakil ve'azal achayre de Rabbi Yirmiyah aguda de yama disdaim. Ravin would walk behind Rabbi Yirmiyah on the Dead Sea shore. Amarlei, and he asked the question. Ravin asked Rabbi Yirmiyah, Mahu lemimshei mehani maya b'shabata. Are we allowed to wash our eyes with this water? Rashi, mi asur mishum refuah de gazer rabbanim mechol refuahs b'Shabbos mishum schikas hamamonim ve'elu marpois as ha'ayin. Are we allowed to wash with the Dead Sea waters, even though they have medical healing properties, as Alan told us, even based on contemporary science? And usually we say that one is prohibited from doing anything that has medical and healing benefits. Amarlei Shapir Dami, and Rav Yirmiyah responded, yes, you can. Why can you wash yourself with this very healing, healthy waters, even though you're not allowed to do other medical and wellness treatments? Rashi explains, Lav mucha milsa, the refuah of it. It's not obvious that what you're doing is for a remedy. Afal pi shamar pen shari, although it does heal, the time of the refuah dasira leisa l'gzeira shama yisrak samanim the dami letzchina shu'amalachai. The reason why you're not allowed to do certain healing efforts is because we then may make the mistake of thinking that we're allowed to grind up herbs and other medicines on Shabbos. But here, where the act of cleaning with the water is somewhat removed from being certainly a healing practice, therefore it is permissible. The Ben Yehuda here points out that this question was just a question for mental gymnastics. Obviously, he never thought that they meant to say that wood could sink and humans can't sink, because that's something that everybody knows. But he wanted to make this point that it was inclusive, or was adding even human beings, and because it was a cute play on words based on the fact that Sodom, according to tradition, the Dead Sea, according to tradition, is the result of the flipping of Sodom, and the crater turned into a place of salty water. The Gemara continues on the subject. Okay, so you're allowed to cleanse yourself. You're allowed to rinse your eye or yourself, even though it is healing. But what about mahu lemimatz u lemiftach? Are you allowed to close and open your eyes in the water? Now, I will tell you something. I was in the Dead Sea once or twice, and the lightest amount of water getting into your eye is no fun. Or
Definitely, I agree with you, Rabbi. I agree with you. I agree with you.
Right? You don't want salt water to get into your eyes. But sometimes they say no pain, no gain. And so if you know that you have an eye problem and the way it'll be healed is by allowing the temporary irritation of the Dead Sea waters, I suppose you'd allow it to happen. So again, I don't know if Alan, would you advise anyone putting a droplet of Dead Sea water into their eye? Here, you're muted.
I don't know much about the what an optometrist or an ophthalmologist would say, but
you're a
I wouldn't do it.
You gotta know everything. All right, so let's see Rashi. Mahu lemimatz lemiftach loshen ein ma'amtzen asames. Oitzem einav kishurechetz mihem b'Shabbos. Mahu sheyazgir v'yiftach einav kadei sheikones man la'ayin. Can you do something that will intentionally allow the water to get into your eye? So Rav Yirmiyah says, "Kayotza ba zulay shamati." I don't have a tradition on this matter to share with you. Kayotza ba shamati, but I do have a teaching that is along the same lines. What is that? Rav Yirmiyah. Zimnin Amar La Mishmei Rav Masla, Zimnin Amar La Mishmei Rav Mar Ukva. Rav Zera conveyed a teaching either in the name of Rav Masla or Mar Ukva, but Tarvayu Mishmei Davod Shmuel V'Levi Amrin, and both of them also conveyed the teaching in the name of the earlier generation, Shmuel and Levi. Chad Amar Yain B'Teich Ayin Aser Al Gav Ayin Muter. One said that you're allowed to place wine on top of you're not allowed to put wine into your eye. You're allowed to place wine on top of your eye. Chad Amar, the other said, Roik tafel al gav ha'ayin aser. Others said you're not allowed to put fresh saliva. Okay, what we're talking here about is the first saliva of the day. When a person wakes up and they haven't rinsed their mouth, so once upon a time it was understood that there were medical benefits to or uses to that saliva. I'm sure there's a scientific theory today, but I cannot and share that with you. I don't know what it is. But the bottom line here is that we have two instances where there are substances that although they may be placed on top of the eyelid, they cannot be put into the eye. Or rather, I should say one, you can put on your eye, not in your eye. The other, you can't even put on your eye. Let's see Rashi's here. The refuah of it, whenever it is evident that what you're doing is for medical purposes, Asr, one is prohibited to do so. By opening and closing your eyes, which would take effort because, this is my conjecture, I don't know, because it's not that comfortable and so it's going to be a whole production, that would not be allowed. I guess what we're saying is being that the salt, the Dead Sea, has a lot of salt. Here we can infer that you shouldn't use it to rinse your eyes in this manner.
Rabbi, rinsing.
Hold on one second. Why can you put wine in your eye? Once upon a time, people would rinse their face with wine. Today we don't. At least, I mean, I don't know. Is there any kind of facial out there that's a wine facial? We can actually do. We can. Okay. Dr. Hammer, maybe we're onto something. We can start the Talmud facial.
Absolutely.
Rinse your face with wine. Okay, but once upon a time, that's what they did, and therefore it is not evident that you're doing it for medicinal purposes. But if you put it in your eye, that would only be for medicinal purposes. Right? Person that hasn't rinsed or introduced anything to their mouth, that saliva has or had certain value for healing. And therefore, you can't even put on your eye because it's only for healing. By the way, there's a story in the Gemara. Was it Rav Meir's one? I don't remember. The lady whose husband said, "Don't come back to me until you spit in the great rabbi's face." Remember the story? And the rabbi tells her, "Oh, actually, I have an eye problem. Please come spit in my eye because I can use your." So, anyways, so here we have a discussion about. Well, we're not done yet, but the question about healing on Shabbos, if it's not evident, it can be done. If it is evident, it can't be done. The Gemara now wants to figure out who said what. So we have two teachings. We have Shmuel and Levi. And we don't know who said what. The Gemara is now going to try to figure out who said what. So I think we can figure out, says the Gemara, that Shmuel's father is the one who said that you're not allowed to put wine in your eye, but you can put wine on your eye. Why? Because Shmuel taught that you're allowed to dip bread you're allowed to dip bread in wine on Shabbos, and then dab it on your eye. Who do you think he was taught this by? Surely he learned it from his father, and therefore it makes sense that Shmuel's father is the one who permits dabbing wine on top of your eye, not into your eye. The says, hold on, Shmuel actually taught another halacha, which is you're not allowed to put the reik tafel, you're not allowed to put the saliva on the eye. The Shmuel Iman, that probably he heard from his father. Bottom line is, Shmuel heard both these teachings. One he heard from his father, one he heard from his father's colleague Levi, and we are not certain who did either, and therefore it remains uncertain. So we don't know who taught what, but we do know that for healing, something that is obviously healing, exclusively healing, cannot be done on Shabbos. Something that has other purposes, I don't want to use the word mundane, but non-medicinal, non-healing, they can be done because it is not certain that the act that's being done here is for the purpose of healing.
It is so dangerous to put saliva into somebody's eye, because if that person has a cold or an infection, he's transferring it immediately into the other person's eye.
One place where all my publications are.
Just out of curiosity,
even my scientific.
Hold on, we're hearing some background noise. Doctor?
Should the focus be on the alcohol content of wine? Is that how important is that? And can you go from there to other alcoholic beverages, or is it different law? Can you use grape juice? Is that okay?
So here's what I'll tell you. I don't think the Gemara here is trying to teach us medicine, and I don't think the Gemara is actually advising us to put saliva or any unsterile approved beverage in the eye. The Gemara is teaching us a broader principle, which is there are certain practices that are beneficial in healing, but also done for other reasons, and that may be done on Shabbos. And then there are other treatments that are exclusively done for medical purposes, and that cannot be done on Shabbos. In the time of the Gemara, medicine advised putting spittle into the eye, certain types of spittle into the eye. Maybe they would first interview the person and make sure they were in good health. I don't know. And they would also use wine to rinse the eye. And wine was also generally used as a cleaning agent. And so the principle that we're extracting is more general and not specific to the liquids being used. And again, certainly I would not advise, don't put your own saliva into your eye, and certainly don't get your friend's saliva in your eye if you can help it. And that is the story. So again, it's teaching us more of a general principle than a specific medical suggestion. And the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch point out the same. Be'ezer Hashem, tomorrow we'll continue a little bit more on the subject of eye remedies, Shabbos, and then we'll continue. Dr. Stam, if you have the opportunity to do some Google research, maybe you can help us figure out what the origin, or if there is any scientific basis to fresh saliva and dealing with eye maladies.
Okay.
Shkoyach. Dear friends, I want to wish you a wonderful day. I'm grateful that you were here. And I didn't say it at the beginning, but let us daven for the well-being of the dear members of our Chabura and their households, and only good news for Klal Yisrael. And that's the most important thing. So thank you all. We'll hope to see everybody tomorrow. Yashar Koyach.
Shkoyach, thank you.